Good morning. I'm Associate Professor Joy Parkinson, and I would like to welcome you to our very exciting panel this morning, a new look at consumer vulnerability, the why, what, how, and where of adopting a strengths-based approach. So just on behalf of the Best Centre at QUT, ServCollab and AASM, I'd like to welcome you this morning and thank you for joining us. And just before we get started, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land. So we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, and we pay respect to their elders, their laws, their customs, and their creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. And we acknowledge the important role that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. So just to let you know how it's going to work today and give you the agenda that we're going to follow. First of all, we're going to have Professor Ray Fisk, who's joining us from Texas State University in the US, and he's going to be looking at why serving all of humanity is needed. So Ray brings us a wealth of experience in working with different groups, and particularly in services. He works across a range of different contexts, and it more recently has started looking at some of the intricacies around refugees, for example. And then we'll have Dr. Rowan Bedggood, who's going to look at what does it mean to change the narrative of consumer vulnerability using a strengths-based lens. And she brings us a wealth of experience working with minority and vulnerable consumers as well, in a range of different services contexts as well. Then we have Professor Rebekah Russell-Bennett, who is the co-director of the Best Centre at QUT. And Rebekah's going to talk to us about how to move from loss to gain framing of social issues. And in particular, she's going to focus on the Women's Butterfly Project for empowering mature women. And again, Rebekah brings a wealth of experience in services marketing and also in social marketing. So, you know, helping people to change their behaviours for social good. And then finally, we have Professor Maria Raciti, who is from the University of Sunshine Coast. And she's going to be looking at where do human rights fit in strengths-based service design. And again, Maria brings us a wealth of experience and particular insight from her perspective as an Aboriginal woman as well. So she brings some very specific and cultural insight as well. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Ray Fisk to take us away. And how it will work today as well is each of the speakers will speak, and then we will have time for 1 or 2 questions at the end of their talk. There'll be a range of activities throughout the session, and then at the end we'll have some more time for questions for the panel. So thank you very much, Ray.
Thank you, Joy. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. Well, let me get right to it. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be a co-sponsor of this event. And my talk is titled, Why Serving All of Humanity is Needed. And as Joy has mentioned, I'm the founder of ServCollab. I'm also a professor of marketing at Texas State University. So before I actually show you my main topics, let me show you this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Now, this is a quote from 1963. It's a quote from my childhood. Martin Luther King was a very famous civil rights advocate. He was assassinated 5 years later, and I became obsessed with unfairness as a result of the civil rights struggles and the feminist struggles and so many other struggles that I saw during my childhood. But let me key in on part of this quote because it's very relevant to today, especially. That phrase, inescapable network of mutuality. Part of the problem with vulnerability is that there are people who are causes of the vulnerability that other people are experiencing. So that's part of the context here, that that we're all connected. But let me flip it just a little bit, because we're all living in COVID times. You could substitute the word mutuality for vulnerability, and we could say inescapable network of vulnerability. That we're all living in an inescapable network of vulnerability because of COVID. And until most of the planet, until the vast majority of humans on planet Earth are vaccinated, COVID will still be killing some of us. We will be trapped until we can address that. And hopefully we'll be able to get to it soon, because most of us are quite tired of talking about COVID. So here are my topics. If I can get the button to work to let me advance the slides here. Sometimes it doesn't. There we go. I've got 3 topics for you today. The first is ServCollab's perspective on elevating human experience. The second is preventing exclusionary service systems that cause vulnerabilities. And third, to enable inclusive service systems that respect human capabilities. So prevention and enabling. So before I get to that though, what is ServCollab? Our name is a contraction of serving humanity through collaboration. Now, I've been obsessed and involved in service research my entire academic career. Joy was touching on that. The collaboration part of this name is because I'm convinced, and we are convinced, the officers and I and the advisory board and I are all convinced that collaboration is really how we make progress as a species. Now, a descriptive name or description of ServCollab is that ServCollab is a service research collaborative for diagnosing and treating humanity's service system problems. And I'm going to focus mostly today on diagnosing service system problems. So the first of my 3 topics then is ServCollab's perspective on elevating human experience. And the title of a recent paper we published last year is Elevating the Human Experience Through Service Research Collaborations, Introducing ServCollab. You can see all of the authors of that paper down below there. And the other 6 are the members of the advisory board for ServCollab. They were all, and still are, great friends of mine that I've written with before. Most of us are marketing professors. David Bowen's a management professor, and Leah Patricio is an engineering perspective. So we've got multiple countries too, because Thorsten Gruber's in the UK, Leah Patricio is in Portugal. So we've got more than one country involved as well. So the 7 of us were trying to decide what is it that we are trying to accomplish, and we decided that elevating human experience was the right name for that. So here's more on elevating human experience. There's 3 nested levels of human experience that we all have, and just 3. First, the personal experience, in other words, the more micro level of a person's experience. It's all in our heads in one sense, because what we experience is what we can remember and what we can perceive. Those are our personal experiences. Then there's another level above that, the social experiences, the middle level of systems. The social experience is essential for us as a species because we are a social species. We need each other. We can't survive without each other. And then the third level is even higher up, the external experience with our external environments. Now, these are nested so that our personal experience occurs in the social experience and occurs in the external experience. And in fact, some of our most favorite memories are those which are memories where we're with other people in external environments. Like if you were walking along the Brisbane River, as I've been fortunate to do when I visited Brisbane, or in many of the other parts of the world in your own local environment, or if you go traveling as a tourist. External experiences matter, social matter, but they all are part of our personal too. Now, that gets me to a key point about service. Service is in that social level. Service occurs in interactions. And here I need to give you a quick context. My childhood was in Las Vegas. I graduated from high school in Las Vegas. So as a high school kid, my buddies and I would hang out in casinos. And in those casinos, we would see lots and lots of human interactions of 2 kinds. We would see social interactions, people saying hello to each other, smiling, patting each other on the back, having a great time talking to each other. Very social. But we also saw, of course, lots of monetary interactions because this was Vegas. It was often called lost wages when I was a kid because people would lose their money. They'd go to Vegas and lose their money, lost wages. Social and monetary. Those are 2 key parts of the service economy. In my early days of service, we were only focused on the monetary And with ServCollab, we're trying to bring the social and the monetary more together. So we're studying the whole human experience, not just social, not just monetary, both. Now, vulnerability, to get more specifically to vulnerability can occur at any experience level. And here I've separated them along a linear line from the personal on the left to the social in the middle. And I've made that circle bigger because that's the shared reality of our social experiences. It is very influential and overlaps into our personal and overlaps into our external on the other side. Social aspects of our human experience drive so much of what vulnerability is about. It can make it better if people are helped during social experiences, or social experiences can make us more vulnerable. Now, a different way of looking at vulnerability is to look at a life experience from child to adult to senior. So there are 3 ages that are typically talked about in those. First age being the child, second age the adult, and third age, of course, senior. There's a vulnerability at each stage. There's a vulnerability, especially as a child, because of course, none of us have the ability to even walk as a child or feed ourselves, and it takes a while. It takes decades to become an adult. And then there are fewer vulnerabilities as an adult, but there are still certainly some. And then as a senior, there are new vulnerabilities that can show up. All of those are tied to life experience and vulnerability. Now, a new concept the ServCollab has just been working on, and this I've been working on with Linda Alkire, who was in the previous paper. She's part of the advisory board. She's also part of our board of directors for ServCollab. She and I have got a forthcoming paper that we titled Service Ecosystem Health, a transformative approach to elevating service experience. And in that, we propose the metaphor of service ecosystem metaphor that contributes to logic for enabling service science to serve the full spectrum of human needs in our human ecology. Now, there is already a public health sector, which is in the center of the meso level of what I've got on this diagram. There's a planetary health field that you might not have ever heard of. It was relatively new to me when we started doing our research. And we all know about personal health. And COVID has had us all thinking about personal health and public health because we don't want to get COVID. Nobody wants to get COVID. Nobody wants to be exposed to COVID. So the public health issues have become a bigger and bigger issue. But to apply this metaphor the way we are applying it, all those other things in that meso level, in addition to healthcare, education services, food and nutrition, financial, public services, entertainment and lifestyle services, they're also part of the service ecosystem health logic that we're trying to apply. In other words, all service systems influence our human well-being, our health. Now, there are 2 key challenges tied to this system logic. One is the challenge of scale, the other is of complexity. And to elevate the human experience, ServCollab encourages building on 2 concepts. First, this one I just showed you, service ecosystem health. We think by applying the concept of service ecosystem health to fully serving the needs at any scale, we can better solve problems. And by any scale, I mean the personal, the meso, and the larger planetary level. And second, intersectionality. Now, this was a concept developed by a Black feminist scholar. And about 30 years ago, she developed this concept of looking at how multiple things can create more vulnerability for someone. And this is basically a concept of complexity. Intersectionality describes the complexity of each human's personal experience. Each of us has a different intersectionality. Certainly some have greater problems because of intersectionality than others. Now that gets me to the second topic, which is preventing exclusionary service systems that cause vulnerabilities. So there are common marketplace discriminations that you all are, I think, well aware of. There's differential treatment based on factors such as gender or race or ethnicity or age, disability, gay, lesbians, transgender. There's so many possible ways that discrimination can happen and is happening today around the world. Now this is, in terms of marketing, the opposite of what we mean by segmentation. When we do segmentation right in marketing, we're doing segmentation to better serve different customers. We aren't trying to hurt them. No, we're trying to help them. So if we're trying to serve women, we're trying with segmentation to serve women better. And I could make a longer list of those segmentation points, but I think sometimes segmentation is used for the wrong purposes. Some companies have used it for the wrong purposes instead of the right ones. And last, disadvantaged customers, people in poverty, minority status, old age, or even language difficulties. The United States, like Australia, has a lot of people coming from many parts of the world in multiple languages. Anyone who's not familiar with the local language can be faced with a disadvantage. Now, that gets me to the third part of my talk, which is enabling inclusive service systems that respect human capabilities. And this is based on an article that was conceived in Brisbane at a conference in 2017. The co-authors of the project are all listed below on the slide. In addition to me, Allison Dean, Linda Elcar, Allison Jover, Josephine Previty, Nicola Robertson, and Mark Scott Robinson are all part of that project. Most of them are Australians. The two Allisons, Joe and Nicola, are all Australians, and Mark and Linda and I are the ones from the United States. So the title was Designed for Service Inclusion, Creating Inclusive Service Systems by 2050. I have to emphasize that this article was a major inspiration for me deciding to create ServCollab. So here's what we meant by service inclusion in that article. It's an egalitarian system that provides customers with fair access to a service, fair treatment during a service, and fair opportunity to exit a service. And we were basically proposing a global service standard to provide all customers with equitable access to the value inherent in marketplace exchanges. And it's linked to the transformative service research literature that I've been part of and many others on the team have been part of. And it's a focus on customer, societal, and even global well-being. Now, one more slide tied to service inclusion. This is a slide that we developed at the time, ideas rather that we developed at the time that we were calling the 4 pillars of service inclusion. What I'm going to show you with the red text is revised from that. So I'll get to the revisions in a moment. So the first of the pillars was enabling opportunity, empowering people by providing access to services and the ability to receive and co-create valued services. Now, the second of the pillars was originally offering choice, but in a recent project that Rebekah Russell-Bennett and I are part of on the digital divide, we're trying to take a strengths-based approach to that, which is very relevant to what we're working on today for this workshop. And as a result, we decided that the pillar needed to be relabeled and redefined. So we now have it as enabling choice, empowering people with viable choices for configuring their resources, opportunities, and skills. And we reconfigured the third pillar altogether. We're calling it nurturing healing, providing the essential services that fulfill basic human needs, such as the needs for water, food, and shelter, and social needs, and information needs in diverse service contexts. And last of the 4 pillars, fostering happiness, encouraging people to experience the pleasure the services can provide. So finally, to wrap up my talk, ServCollab is eager to encourage research projects on aspects of vulnerability. And our first project that we have encouraged is titled Rethinking Service Systems and Public Policy, a Transformative Refugee Service Experience Framework. And that was published in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing just this year. You can see a long list of authors, and I won't try to read all those names to you since there's 13 of us. I will, however, emphasize that there are 8 different nationalities represented, 7 different countries represented. This project was started in Florida in the United States. And I'm delighted to say that I'm the only one of them that's actually a native-born American. Everyone else was born somewhere else on planet Earth. And we've got Germans in there. We've got people from Lebanon in there, from Turkey, Romania, Australia. The Chung's from Australia. So it's a very diverse group of co-authors, all focusing on refugees. And what we were trying to do with this article was create a foundation for other people in other countries to do research on refugee experiences in those countries and how could you make them better, as opposed to worse. How could you make them better? And with that, let me stop and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. We have time for a question or two, if anybody's got a question. If you want to type those questions into the chat, that would be great. But I just have a quick question for you, Ray. How did you recognise that you needed to make some adjustments to service inclusion pillars 2 and 3?
Well, it was mainly an issue that we really thought we weren't quite, in the original definitions, we really weren't quite describing the context the way we needed to. They were more of a deficit language, and it was more of an accident than anything else. And when we were writing it, we were certainly not, when we did that inclusion piece in 2017, thinking about it the way now, 4 years later, I'm thinking about things now. And of course, ideally, progress is that way. Ideally, people will say, well, that's what we thought then, but it was time to think again and to do an even better job. So that's exactly why we changed it. We decided it wasn't good enough.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your openness and honesty about that. And I think, you know, as researchers and practitioners, we are continually having to evolve our thinking and adjusting as we, you know, develop our knowledge as well. And I just wanted to highlight to everybody and point you in the direction of the Padlet activity as well. So if you want to just head to the chat, you can see the link there. To share your thoughts on making service systems more inclusive. Another question for you, Ray, how do we give communities choice in the climate change and energy policy space when we have set much needed targets and transitioning away from gas, you know, towards renewables? And what does choice mean in that context and more generally under capitalism?
That's a very complicated question. Among the greatest challenges I think our species faces is the issue of choice in a community setting. And I really think that one of the better laboratories for service research today is in cities on the kinds of issues you just raised in that question. I don't think any of the climate change crises we're facing are going to be easy to address. But we all know, if we've been paying much attention to the climate change history, that the planet is warming up and it's not going to get better unless we do something about it. Certainly Australia has seen many problems. Every part of the world is seeing problems. So to me, the challenge is how can communities decide together on ways of reducing their local footprint. I'll give you an example from my own experience. My father was a climate change denier during his last days of his life. And I could get him to agree on one thing, though, because even though he was not convinced that humans were significant to the planet and we could never overheat the planet, I was able to show him that in the local communities, there was lots of evidence of microclimates where in cities, the nighttime temperatures were getting too high at night. And there was plenty of evidence that he was willing to believe that. So I think in the local communities, if you show people that it's getting too hot and we can do something locally to reduce our temperatures, our water needs to be cleaner, we can do something to clean our water, we can do things to tell each other how we can reduce energy. There's a lot of interesting research on, if you know what other people are doing to reduce energy, you start to want to do it too. We want to be on the right side of history, most of us. So I think it helps if people sort of see that as, well, I'm trying to do the right thing too. But it won't be easy. These are some of the greatest challenges our species is facing, and they're not trivial.
Thank you. That was very insightful. So thank you for joining us this morning, Ray. And I would ask you to be prepared for some more questions at the end of the session this morning or this evening in your time. Thank you.
Sure.
And next, I would like to ask Rowan Bedggood to share her slides. And Rowan's the chair of GEER Australia, and she's also from Swinburne University of Technology in Victoria. So thank you so much for joining us, Rowan.
There we go. Thank you very much, Joy, and thank you, Ray. That was really interesting talk. I was taking notes. I'm here to talk about what is consumer vulnerability and why it's important to change the narrative. Hopefully I can get my slide transitions going. No, it's not working. There we go. So I'm the chair of GEER Australia, which is a group of energy efficiency researchers, and our focus is on improving the energy-related wellbeing of Australian households. Our members are from all sorts of organisations, And if you'd like to know more about GEER, I'll pop the website in there. So I'd like to start off by introducing you to John. John works casually as a barista. He works part-time as a plumber as well, and COVID has meant he now works diverse jobs to make ends meet. And I just want you to think about in the back of your mind as we go through this talk, how vulnerable is John? I also want you to meet Joan. Joan is a barrister. Slight twist there. She used to be full-time, but she's now trying to get her online consulting legal firm going, which is tough going for her. She lost her job as a barrister during COVID, and she's trying to find a new source of income. So how vulnerable is Joan? So I want you to think of the vulnerability of John and Joan as I go through. All right, so before getting you to the present with vulnerability, I thought we'd go in the past and look at how the concept of it has been conceptualized in the past. And it's been often associated with people and their characteristics, and it's been assumed that somehow those characteristics determine the vulnerability. So things like people's income and their affordability is often enshrouded in definitions of vulnerability, but also it's been thought of as being residing in specific cohorts of people, and I've got some examples there. The problem with that is, well, there's many problems, but one of them is there's a whole bunch of people that in these cohorts here that are not vulnerable and don't particularly feel vulnerable, let alone whether the term is useful anyway, which I'll get to in a sec. One of the early definitions of consumer vulnerability was back in '97, and I'll let you have a moment to read that yourself. You'll see that I've highlighted that it's got the word characteristics in there. So this is really in keeping with this theme that was around at the time. There's been a more recent shift in thinking, and probably a few key points that have propelled some changes. And the first one is that defining people by their characteristics is not only inappropriate, but it's stigmatizing. So there's a new move now that we need to understand people by what they're facing rather than who they are. So as soon as we look at what people are facing, we realize there's a shift from looking at people's characteristics to looking at their circumstance or situation. And we see this as a positive move forward. Some other things from the literature have included the importance of treating people with dignity and respect, and somehow reflecting that in our narrative and our definitions. The whole topic of today's talk is the move towards a strengths-based lens, and that sort of started the move away from a deficit-based lens. I've got to say, though, most people did not realise, and I certainly haven't either, that I had a deficit-based lens, or that I was using language that propelled that. So I think it's the first thing is to have a bit of an eye-opener, and I'm hoping that some of you experience that today, and others will have, well, what do I do about it now that I realise what's going on? And the last point from the literature is the notion of underconsumption. And this is particularly relevant in the area where I research, which is in energy efficiency, where a lot of people or households are unable to use energy as they'd like. They have to forego food or forego other essentials or forego using energy in order to be able to get by. So perhaps one of the most widely cited definitions of consumer vulnerability is by Baker and colleagues. And I've just highlighted in black there probably the key points where consumer vulnerability is a state of powerlessness. So the word state is really good to see in a definition because that's a circumstance or a situation. The state of being is a situation that you're in. It also goes on to say that control is not with the individual and they're dependent on other external factors, for example, marketers and other entities, to create fairness for them. But I'd like to go back to a simpler view of the word vulnerability itself. And first of all, it means the potential of being harmed, or in a little bit more detail, it is the risk to harm, the risk to your physical, emotional, or psychological well-being when subjected to life events or difficult things that happen, adversities. So it seems to be then that the word vulnerability, if that's our risk to being harmed or risk to suffering, we probably need a different term to describe what happens once we start suffering. So the vulnerable to harm, this is a picture of someone juggling balls, is different from once people are already experiencing that physical and or emotional and or psychological harm. So we say two terms are needed. The being vulnerable to harm, we can say is vulnerability, but what do we call it once people are suffering harm? And we realise that people are going through hard times, and hard times is situational. It also suggests that it's not permanent. So we've come up with the word hardship to distinguish between the two. Of course, people in hardship are vulnerable to being harmed because they're already being harmed, but there is a distinction. What happens with well-being here is that at very low levels of well-being, very low levels of vulnerability, people will have a high level of well-being. They are probably highly resilient to anything that comes their way that might throw them off the ball. As resilience reduces, well-being declines, and we can see the link over into experiencing harm or suffering. It's important that we recall that we are all vulnerable. And so echoing what Ray just said, we all have some level of vulnerability, and it will change depending on our circumstance. I don't know about you, but last year when I went to the supermarket and I saw there was no toilet paper on the shelf, I had half a toilet roll at home, and I was like, what am I going to do? I felt very vulnerable in that moment. So we might feel vulnerable for different things for different reasons, and depending on what's going on in our life. So why separate these two terms? The most important thing, in my view, is that each state, whether we're in a state of vulnerability or a state of hardship, we will probably require different things to help improve our situation. So in a large energy efficiency project we worked on last year and earlier this year, we introduced something called the PSR framework, which we call prevention, support and relief. And it's ways of reducing both vulnerability and hardship. So we start off by thinking about these structural barriers. And structural barriers are things in a system that exist beyond the person's control, beyond the individual or household. We need to remove structural barriers. And in the energy space, there are many structural barriers, which I won't go into now, but they need to be removed if we're going to alleviate people's level of vulnerability and hardship. And we have to also acknowledge that these are imposed on people. So for example, in Australia, we have extraordinarily high energy prices. This puts a whole lot of us into a situation of affordability. And if we didn't have such high prices, that wouldn't be the case. So we need to address these structural barriers as a pressing issue in most areas. We also need to help support people by relieving the impact of their personal situation or any personal factors that are going on. It could be that they've got to suddenly care for someone. They might have extra visitors in the home. They might become ill. They might lose a job, whatever's going on for them individually. But once people are in hardship, we argue that they need support to manage the impact of that harm, and we need to provide them with some sort of care and guidance and to help them move out of hardship. And lastly, relief. We need to provide immediate assistance to relieve harm. If people have no food, there's no point putting new light bulbs in their house to be energy efficient. We need to give them some food first. So to give you some examples of how a definition worked in this project for energy hardship, which might translate to any area that you work into, we came up with this. When a household is unable to use sufficient energy services in the home to live a comfortable, dignified and healthy life without restricting other essential needs. So you can see here that we've factored in those recent shifts in the literature. We've got this pictured as a situation. We've got the concept of dignity and comfort embedded, and without restricting other essential needs, we've ticked off those coping strategies or those underconsumption issue. You'll also notice that the definition is devoid of the causes of the state, the things that drive people towards hardship. So we're just trying to capture the state itself and separate it from what causes it. And there's nothing about the characteristics of people. But the next thing is, well, what about vulnerability then? We can just add 4 words to make this a definition of energy vulnerability. when a household is at risk of being unable to use sufficient services. And lastly, what about energy well-being? So moving towards our strengths-based view, what does that look like? Well, we just need to remove 2 letters when a household is able to use sufficient energy services in the home. So you can see that this definition can become very versatile. So maybe this could be a platform for you to try some definitions in your sectors. So the next leap in thinking, we believe, is changing the narrative around how we talk about these things. So while we suggest vulnerability and hardship best describe a state, that they're useful terms, we don't believe that programs, policies, or strategies should use such terms. And that's because they need to interface with the consumer. And if you ask me, for example, how vulnerable I feel at any point in time, I may not want to answer. But if you say, oh, how's your day going? Is it a good day or a not so good day? I might be more comfortable. So we have to use language that people feel comfortable identifying with, and especially if we're offering support services, we would like people to engage them. We want them to reach the people that they're designed to reach. So if we look at what a deficit-based lens is, it represents deficiency. It automatically looks at what is lacking in people, what they don't have, what they fail to have or fail to do. There's also some inherent assumption that people, if they're vulnerable, they will always be vulnerable. It's like as though there's no hope for a better future, which is just inaccurate. It focuses only on the negative consequences of adversity, and yet people are so resourceful in coping with adversity, and we seem to miss that in our narrative. It also somehow assigns blame, that the people who are struggling, who are at risk of suffering and are suffering, that it's their fault that they're in this situation. There's a few more things here that I will skip, but you'll be able to read them on the slides that we hand out. I assume we are handing out slides. So conversely, what does a strengths-based lens look like? And here we can say it acknowledges that situations change and that vulnerability is not static. So that's the first big tick. It also views consumers as being resourceful, being inherently resilient, and having many strengths and capabilities. So this is a very favourable way to view a situation. So Zimmerman mentions resiliency theory, and building resilience is all about building on pre-existing strengths, which naturally lends itself to aligning with a strengths-based view of the world or a view of a situation. So does this really matter what terminology we use? We all know what we mean. Well, we'd like to think that it does. And in fact, let me just walk you through some examples to highlight how odd some of the current terminology is. So these are examples that are drawn from the energy space, which is what we worked in. And this is what I presented to the Commonwealth and Australian governments in our summary. So we have energy hardship programs in Australia, which is bizarre, because I wonder, are they aiming to create and extend hardship? We also have consumer vulnerability policies, and I'm wondering, are they aiming to create and extend vulnerability? It's sort of oddly titled, aren't they? Someone suggested maybe we could have an energy equity framework, and that's probably trying to create and extend equity, which is a good thing, but perhaps insufficient to just stop there. So would for-profit corporations do this sort of thing, call their policies, programs, or strategies these things? Can you imagine a company having a corporate bankruptcy strategy? Like, it wouldn't happen. Would you imagine someone having a declining sales policy? It probably wouldn't occur. So if we think of a deficit-based lens, as you can see, these are the sorts of things that are currently in place: the energy vulnerability policy, a consumer hardship program. But if we turn the corner and start thinking of a strengths-based lens, what could we call these things? You're probably thinking of some ideas now. See if any of these hit the mark for you. They're just suggestions. It could be a consumer support policy that picks up on that word support from the PSR framework, providing support. It could be a consumer assistance program. It could be a consumer enhancement program, or maybe an energy wellbeing framework. It could be a whole lot of things other than describing the very thing we don't want to occur. So I just hark back now to remember John. What you didn't know about John, that John has a wide network of friends and they all help each other out with casual work. So if anyone's down, it's become a bit of a fluid movement for them. John, before COVID, had already paid off his home over the last 10 years. So at least he has no mortgage or rent to pay. And indeed, John and his fiancée are looking forward to getting married next year. So my question now is, how resilient is John? And isn't it better to think of how resilient John is and what resources he has behind him, rather than thinking of just his vulnerability? And what about Joan? Well, Joan may or may not get her online legal firm going, but the good thing is through her career, she had built up a lot of super. So if she does end up having to retire early, she's going to be okay. But she does plan to return to her art. She used to do painting when she was young. She's going to return to that. So now we question, how resilient is Joan? And the real takeaway here is we can't possibly tell whether someone's experiencing vulnerability or whether they're resilient in the face of adversity just simply by looking at them. So changing the narrative is a choice. We can focus on what's wrong, focus on weaknesses, and pursue and perpetuate this deficit lens, which is stigmatizing. Or we can choose to do it differently. And the examples that you've heard from Ray and examples that you'll hear coming forward, it's not easy to do, but we can start, we can choose to try. We can start highlighting areas of strength and harnessing people's innate capabilities and working with them. It's a strengths-based approach, we say, is respectful, and it provides a platform to extend and build people's resilience. Choose wisely. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thanks so much, Rowan, for a really insightful discussion there. We've moved from Ray with the service inclusion and understanding what we need to underpin inclusive services to thinking about how do we actually reduce vulnerability, and the process of how we start to think about changing the narrative and the way that we use language around this, which is really, really important. And you've given us some really good ideas there, Rowan, on how to do that, and some great ways of reframing the language that we use and some of the catchphrases and messaging that we use as well. But a question for you, how can we, as you know, I know that on this webinar this morning, we've got a lot of people who work with different types of vulnerable consumers. How can we start to advocate for change of language and the way that policymakers use language? What do you have some tips for us?
Look, so the example I gave you with energy was real, and I think that if we start giving people other options and make those options easy, then people will be more likely to adopt it. One of the ones here today is how we use the word vulnerable, whether it's a noun or an adjective. So if we say vulnerable consumers, we are now assigning the word vulnerable to the consumer. We're describing them. But if we say consumer vulnerability, then the vulnerability becomes the noun. And that's a hard shift, by the way, because we naturally say we're thinking of vulnerability and then we think of vulnerable consumers. So if I started forcing myself to say consumers experiencing vulnerability or consumer vulnerability and trying to change that around, because as our language, people copy what other people say, as our language changes, it starts perpetuating out. But it's also just being open to it and going, hang on a minute. Look, if you go to the GEER website now, I've got to tell you, there's language in there that I'm now going to change. So like Ray said, it's a journey of discovery. It's learning from others, but also reflecting on yourself and thinking, oh gosh, have I really framed this in the best way I can? Because not framing it in the best way I can, it's not really about you or your program. It's about the people that it's trying to reach. And if it's not working, then we really need to change what we do. But there's also a sign that goes with that. There's a whole lot of judgments and stereotyping that doesn't help anyone, and it really affects people's self-efficacy and self-worth.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for that. It's very insightful. A couple of other questions here around language. Thanks to Lena. What would be a good reframe for the unfortunate term hard to reach populations, and building on the above, the word minority?
It's really hard, because we're talking about groups. So instead of talking about groups, maybe we can talk about situations. So what is it that, so as soon as we start to talk about people, we're naturally going to go to easy terms to describe them, and the demographics are the really easy ones, or those low-income people. So I'm not classified as low income, but I felt quite vulnerable when I got an energy bill, a gas bill of $1,200. I struggled to pay it. I have to wait, so we can't just say that it's about some demographic character. So if we look at people's circumstances, the situations they're facing, so we actually framed, defined different states of hardship, and we put terms around those states, and those states might be the better terminology to use. So we had people who were in a battle-on state of hardship, or people who were in acute state of hardship. The same could be done for maybe vulnerability, that people are at various levels of vulnerability and they are different states. I think it's much more useful to describe a state that people are in than characteristics about them.
Thank you. Yeah, just that reframing of the language we use, really helps to refocus the way that we actually view the situation that we're working with, and the people that we're working with as well. Well, thank you so much, Rowan. That was really insightful. I'm sure that everybody agrees that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, next, I would like to invite Rebekah Russell-Bennett to present her presentation on how to move from loss to gain framing of social issues. Thanks, Rebekah.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Joy. And thank you so much, Rowan. Rowan's available for parties, 21st bar mitzvahs. And I can see that there's quite a few questions in the chat. So Rowan will, and I'm dropping you in here, will answer those in the chat so we can have a conversation within a conversation. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. So I'm going to pick up on the themes from both Ray and Rowan and give you an example of a project that we've completed. And it was very much a reflected journey from where we started. And we did start with the best of intentions, but we did have a lot of deficit language, and it was through the program and that we developed that we actually realized this. And so I want to acknowledge, first of all, the country that I'm on with the traditional owners, the Jagera and the Turrbal people. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues from this project who are here, and that's Kate, Alex, Joy, Melissa and Sam. I think they're the only ones from the project that are here. And also two really key partners for us that have worked on it with us, and hopefully will continue as we're now in field. And that's Suncorp Bank and Moreton Bay Council. And this project was funded by the Department of Housing, and we're really grateful for the opportunity. So let's start off with why is language important? So thanks for the segue there, Rowan. Humans like to sort and classify. We like to put people into categories and boxes. It is an innate way that our brain works. We are hardwired to sort and classify. So it's easy for us, or easier for us, to label people. You know, the term that the literature uses for this is it's identity first language, and it puts the condition first as the description. So for instance, we talk about a homeless person or a drug addict. And that has been a traditional way that we speak about the cohorts. And again, with the best of intentions, we want to help people not be homeless. But there's also been a move away from this, as Rowan said, particularly in the consumer vulnerability area, where we're starting to now label the situation. And part of that, it really does reframe the argument. And it's a harder language. And what's harder is it increases the word count, which for an academic is a nightmare, because we're always trying to reduce the word count in our articles so that we can get our publications. You know, why use 3 words when we could just use 1? And so if we're saying a person experiencing homelessness, that's a lot more in the mouth, and it's a lot more words. And so you can sort of see naturally why the term homeless person kind of rolls off the tongue. It's easier than saying a person experiencing homelessness. but it becomes really important. Now, a note here is actually some communities do prefer to have identity first. So you just have to be a bit attuned in different communities as to how people want to be referred to. And that, of course, adds a layer of complexity, but the default should be labelled the situation unless otherwise advised. And so basically the literature is moving a very long way to saying we should classify the circumstance, not the characteristic. Marketing's been a bit slow off the mark here. I've been doing a lot of reading in the social science area in social services, and they're all over this. They've been doing this for a long time. In marketing, really, this has only hit my radar in the last 18 months. So I feel like I'm a bit behind the 8 ball, because it was the early 2000s that this was really entering the literature. It feels like education and justice. So we know from research that people perceive person-first language as less offensive. And I guess I'd like you to think about which approach best describes your organisation's approach. Would you say a homeless person, or would you say a person experiencing homelessness? So there's the first little pickup for each of us. So in the words of Shakespeare, what's in a name? A rose by any name would be a sweet. Well, actually, language really matters and names really matter. There was a really nice paper I came across by Udihi and Reed from, I think it was Advances in Consumer Research. And their paper is all about language framing policy. And so when person-first language is used, people using drugs is used, people are less supportive of punitive policies. So that's interesting, is that you get more buy-in when you use person-first language. So people experiencing homelessness. Whereas if you say homeless people, well, people assume that the homeless person is there for their own fault. There's far more blame. It's deemed to be permanent, and people are far more supportive of punishing the person. And so there's Udihi and Reed did empirical research. So this is the fallout of the language. And so this is why language matters, because it has very real consequences for political will, for advocacy, and for the kind of strategies that we default to. So this is a US nonprofit organisation, LISC, that invests in communities. And so these are their guiding principles: centre on the person, not the circumstance, focus on assets, not deficits, lead with empathy, not assumptions, and communicate with clarity and specificity. And they're trying to develop a lexicon. And so this is an example on their website. So they were saying, instead of using terms such as blighted, poor, struggling, distressed, use terms such as disinvested neighbourhoods facing structural disadvantage or under-resourced communities. They're actually moving away from using the term vulnerable. And they're trying to avoid terms like addict. They're using terms such as person with substance disorder. But I would say this is still using deficit language. So we need to be both person first and strengths based. So Kate, if you can run the poll, or Sam, if you could pop the poll up, why do we default to loss? Why does it seem to be a human hardwiring that we automatically default to the negatives? And so you can see the poll there. If everyone could just jot that down, have a bit of a guess. Why do we default to loss? So this is kind of behavioural economics 101, psychology 101. What are our fundamental assumptions about why we default to loss? It seems to be part of the human condition. So we've kind of got to fight our biology. Okay, Kate, wrap her up and let's see what people think.
Okay, we've got a few last votes running in. Quick, last chance. Okay, calling it now.
And share the results, Kate. Cool. Okay. Well, it was a kind of a trick question. The answer is all of the above. So you're all correct. See, positive framing. So I want to use the language, I guess, from behavioural economics. I'm in the Centre for Behavioural Economics, Society and Technology. And so I wanted to look at loss framing and gain framing, because I think as we move forward in our research in particular, if I've got to justify in writing, or we've got to justify in a policy report in the workplace, drawing on an existing evidence base can help give us weight to our argument. And so there is a huge amount of research around the effect of loss framing and gain framing. And you can use that then to justify why what might happen when you frame a social issue in the negative or the positive. It's the same as how we might frame an advertisement in the positive and negative. People's brains work the same way. Now, what's interesting is that there's no consensus on the best approach in the message framing literature, with many authors arguing it can depend on a whole range of other factors. So there's a lot of debate in the literature about which approach to use. When should we use loss framing? When should we use gain framing? There'll be people to say that we should be framing social issues negatively because it gets the media's attention. That then gets the political will, that then gets the budgets flowing to our area. So the media is more interested in someone who's homeless than someone who's home seeking. The problem is that that just simply keeps perpetuating the problem. And as Rowan rightly pointed out, no organisation would have the corporate bankruptcy strategy. So in many ways, I think we could learn from the commercial sector in terms of how to think about things. And so we do need to collectively reframe. Just because it's the way it's done currently doesn't mean it's right. So why is it so hard to think positively about social issues? I've drawn on a whole wide range of different discipline literature here, politics, evolutionary psychology. I didn't put all the references. There also are many other reasons. This is just the ones these are my favorites. So we're hardwired to think, to pay attention to danger and risk. We act faster when we pay attention to danger and risk. So we're hardwired to see the negatives before we see the positives. You know, you might go, oh, isn't that a pretty rock over there? And there's a bear running at you. Well, you know, the last thing you'll sort of think after you see the pretty rock is, you know, splat. So we see the bear before we see the pretty rock. There is the role of government. So historically, the role of government has been paternalistic. And I had a look up different websites around what is the role of government in Australia, in the US, and the UK. And it is really to have, it is about having power over others to save them harm or themselves to protect. The word protect and to protect people from themselves is seems to be an underlying assumption that's a hangover from, you know, many centuries of progress. So the traditional role of government is as protector and provider, and those words are actually used when we read about our governmental system. And again, best of intentions, it's a helping role, but it's not about facilitating self-help. It's about helping and saving those people from themselves. We have inherent beliefs about a condition. So if we say homeless people and it's identity first, this is used when the condition is viewed as permanent. It can't be changed. Oh, those poor people, we need to help them from themselves. And there are implicit beliefs about who's responsible. So when we use identity first language, it's a belief that the condition was in the person's control, but they had no willingness to change it. Now, some of you will be thinking, but that's not true. Well, the Udihi and Reed paper actually demonstrates that is in fact how people think when, and they did some research using deficit language and strengths-based language to see what these underlying beliefs are. And so that comes from quite an extensive empirical study where they tested what are the beliefs when you simply change identity first or person first language. And these were the beliefs that came out statistically through their research. So here's an example of what we can do. This is from Warburton and Bredin, and they talk about a strengths-based approach to health and wellness. And I'm not going to go through all this. I've left it particularly in the slides. On the left, these are all the different ways you can do population and person-centered messaging, but it's the deficit. Now, how many of you recognize your own slogans in that? Our children today will die at a younger age than their parents. You're at risk if you don't do 150 minutes, gosh, of moderate to vigorous exercise on a weekly basis. It's all about risk. If you were to reframe it from a strengths-based approach, and that's what this journal article talks about, this is far more active and empowering language. But you have to, first of all, be conscious that the language you're using is deficit. Again, best of intentions, but the evidence is starting to mount up that the deficit approach has some pretty strong unintended consequences. So let's see how it works in action. So here's how we might reframe homelessness. So when we started with the Women's Butterfly Project, we started and it was about preventing homelessness. And so that's a loss framing. It's a problem focus. It's also very much about helping the recipient who may well be passive. And so this was our original problem statement. And anyone who's done human-centered design knows that you have to move from an organization's problem statement to the user's problem statement. And we had unintentionally started from the organization's problem. The problem for the organization was about reducing the number of people who are homeless. That's not an individual's problem. The individual doesn't care about necessarily reducing the number of homeless. They just want to eat that night. They just want to have somewhere that's warm. And so these were the design principles, and this was the benefits. And we had to completely rewrite all of this. And I must say, we've done this multiple times throughout the project. It's like, I'm in horror every time I look at my own collateral to go, am I going to find another deficit term in there? And so again, I'm not going to go through it. I've got this as an example in the slides for later. So we had to reframe it, and I'm going to give you the examples in a moment. So this was our project, the Women's Butterfly Project. We had a number of supporting partners. It was aimed at women over the age of 55, and we were dealing with prevention. And so because it's prevention, we couldn't deal with the usual agencies who come in contact with women who are homeless, because this was women who were maybe at risk and experiencing the triggers. And so we needed to work with organizations like banks or real estate agents or lawyers, because these are the people that come in contact with women who experience 3 of the known triggers of homelessness. And that is a change of job, a change of partner or loss of partner, and an alteration of income. So we framed it change of circumstance as opposed to a loss of something. And so we needed to work at the very pointy end with people whose job it is not to help people who are homeless, using the deficit language. So we had a whole bunch of design principles that we drew out of the literature. And this is like the 10th iteration of this. Every time I see it, I have to keep changing it because I've used the deficit language. But we got there, I think, in the end. So we did, it was all done through co-design. We had expert proxies, we had women with lived experiences. We spoke with Suncorp and Moreton Bay Council in terms of how might we involve them in communicating with women and letting them know about some of their options about dealing with this change of circumstance. And so we used the Maastricht service design framework for that. And so we developed some butterfly personas. So the butterfly metaphor emerged part of the way through this process. We were looking for a metaphor that was empowering, that was strengths-based, and wasn't about you're not going to have a home. You'll notice that while there are images relating to home in the background there's nothing about having no home. There's nothing about sleeping rough. What we've got is 4 personas who are all in a home at this stage with different levels of experiences and problems. And again, we've had to rewrite these persona profiles multiple times to not be about loss. So we've developed a persona quiz for these women, and we've got a digital portal. So the idea is that as women come in contact with a bank and say, you know, I've got a divorce, I've lost my job, that's the immediate trigger for the bank to send them out a very helpful message about this really useful portal for women who are experiencing relationship, changes or the like. There's no words about homelessness, nothing about risk. It's all just about being helpful. Moreton Bay Council will be chatting to women in person. So we've got a high-tech, high-touch approach that we're basically trialing. And so you land on the website. It's all very friendly. This has been through multiple iterations of user testing, accessibility testing. We co-designed it and we're now in field testing it. And so we talk about the butterfly. It's very simple. There's only a couple of pages. It's designed for women who are in a situation of stress. You don't want to be trying to find buttons on a website. There are also no cookies. So if women are experiencing domestic violence or any of those kind of terms, it doesn't remember them. That, of course, has its own challenges because it doesn't remember you, but we needed that to cover all women, even though we weren't focusing on women experiencing those more serious issues. They do a 10-person persona quiz, and we've got some fun things there, like what's your go-to source of comfort. It's all about being fun and empowering and strengths-based, not at all about scaring people. And then they land on a curated page that has different links to wellbeing resources based on their persona quiz. And we've refined this and developed it in conjunction with women to work out what is the most pressing wellbeing issue. And then it's just in the order that our research revealed. And so at the moment, it's not an exhaustive list. It's just a few indicative links that we can then test to see whether this works, and we can roll this out for women. And they can search direct, or they can go via the quiz. They can do it however they like. So the 5 project features that we reframed were basically the project title. We had to change the language of the design principles. We needed to change the profiles to stop saying lack of, loss of, barriers. Importantly here, the strengths-based approach focuses on motivators, not barriers, which was interesting to me as a social marketer. We had to change the quiz from being a serious tone and about risk to being uplifting and about stability. And we had to change the language from resources to capabilities. So we've had a lot of change. I think our web designer has probably had enough of this. I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to get Kate just to put the link in the Padlet. What I'd like you to do is to think about how might we reframe the topic of domestic violence? How do we, go from stop domestic violence? Well, we want to stop it, but what do we want people to do? So have a look at the Padlet and see if you can think of some of the challenges. If you're having difficulty, then that's the place where you need to start, is seeing that challenge. And we've spent a lot of time, and this is not easy reframing it. So basically we need to reimagine and have a gained framing of social issues. We need to reframe the social issue. We need to rewire the brain. We need to revise our language, and we need to redesign our methods to be strengths-based. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was really insightful and great application of changing that narrative and changing the framing of around vulnerability to that strengths-based approach. And as you can all see, it's not an easy thing to do either. It really, challenges the way that we think and the way that we speak about those priority groups that we're actually working with. There's some questions in the chat for you, Rebecca, and in the interest of keeping on time, I'm going to invite Maria to share her slides now. And Maria's going to talk to us today about where do human rights fit in the strengths-based service design. Thanks, Maria.
Take my mute off. Wonderful. And thank you to the previous presenters. This has been a really enriching seminar. And as you'll see with my presentation, it draws through threads from Ray and Rowan, as well as Rebecca. What I wanted to focus on here is about human rights and this interplay between what we're trying to achieve, which is social justice, and how these things come together. So my name is Maria Raciti, and I'm a professor of marketing here at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. So I'm in Queensland. I'm coming to you from Gubbi Gubbi country, which is Aboriginal country here. And I am also a founder and co-director of the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre. So I exist in a very interesting space because I am Aboriginal, but I'm also a professor of marketing. So I bring these things together. I like to say I exist in the space in between. So I'm going to share with you some insights from both. You'll notice there that I've done some work with the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, and I've built a program of research mostly around educational inequality. So I'd like to start out with sort of describing the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre, and what you'll see is some common denominators, not only with the Australian Association of Social Marketing and Ray's organisation ServCollab, as well as the BEST model. So what we're trying to achieve with the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre is we're looking at research by, with and for First Nations and transcultural people. By transcultural, we mean migrant, refugee, and people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. What we're seeking to do with this centre is to actually start to understand different knowledge systems and to understand that Northern Western knowledge systems, which we all subscribe to, which are all a part of our education system in its formal way, is not the only knowledge system. And that what we want to try and do here is use Indigenous and transcultural methodologies and community cultural practices, as well as to exchange knowledge. But what we're really trying to do at the heart of this is we're really pursuing social justice. We want to look at providing supports where they're appropriate for people and needed and asked for, as well as removing barriers that exist. So the one thing that we have in common with AASM, ServCollab, and the BEST Centre, as well as the National Centre for Student Equity, is that we're all pursuing social justice. And I think this is at the heart of talking about vulnerability and at strengths is what is the end goal? What are we trying to achieve with it? So in unpacking social justice, I wanted to first have a look at how the United Nations defines social justice. And in their definition, they point out that the whole purpose of this is for peaceful and prosperous coexistence within and among nations. But one of the important things that they point out is that social justice isn't only about promoting equity and also providing supports for people, but it's also about focusing on removing the barriers that face people of different genders, age, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, and disability. So there's two parts to social justice: providing supports as needed, and also to removing those barriers that are creating the systemic problems in the first place. So there's lots of principles of social justice, but three key ones that I'd like to talk about today is the notion of equity, human agency, which sometimes is sort of grouped under different names, such as self-determination, access to services, for example, and real participation in services, not just tokenistic or superficial participation. And then I'll link that to human rights. So these social justice principles are intertwined, so they're connected together. So I'll walk you through those. We often use the word equality as sort of a default, but it's actually quite different. Equality means that things are the same, whereas equity, which is what we often talk about in social justice, is about things being fair. So I'm sure most of you have probably seen this meme or infographic that circulates around on the web, where it shows this difference between equality and equity. So the goal that we're after is equity. And this is where people get the supports that they need in order to produce that outcome that others, that we can all have access, for example, and fully participate in services. Now, with social justice endeavours, the goal is to address the sources of inequity. So it's one thing to provide supports, that's the first part. So as we can see in the graphic, it's providing the boxes. But at the end of the day, the real achievement of social justice is removing the barrier, or the structural barrier, in this case being the fence that sits between the participants and the game. Now, equity and social justice together uplift human agency. So I'm trying to show you how equity leads to human agency. When we have this equity focus, we can bring forward the social good and the change that we're seeking. Now, the main thing about human agency is it's about volition. It's about people having the choice and choices in the marketplace to interact fully and with freedom as any other person, irrespective of age, race, gender, or any other type of factor or intersectional factor that's identified. Agency matters because that sense of volition, that sense of choice and sovereignty is not something that people from disadvantaged or marginalised groups have at their call. So the whole idea of equity and social justice is to bring forth human agency for people to determine their own and make their own choices. Now, human rights enable social justice. A lot of the literature talks about them being two sides to the same coin. In order to achieve social justice, human rights supports and upholds this. So they work together in lots of ways. Now, human rights is not something that we see a lot in the services and social marketing literature, but there has been a few articles there, such as the one referenced on the bottom. Now, human rights in services and social marketing means that we need to know about what actually is out there in terms of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Now, under the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was ratified in 1948, there's a number of other conventions that exist. Now, the human rights are fundamental inherent rights of all humans, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, or any other status. So within these rights, we as service and social marketers, we should be conscious of these because these frame how the governments of the world view and subscribe to what is equity. Now, there's the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and a number of other conventions that exist underneath. One of the interesting elements, for example, is in the rights of the child under Article 13. It said that children should be protected from all activities that could harm their development. And when I read this, I think about social media, and I think about how that has an interplay and how that is known and has harmed people's development. Yet right here under the UN Human Rights Convention for the Rights of the Child, it's actually indicated as something that we should be preventing in the first place. I see human rights, if you like, as the foundation stone. This is the material that we should be drawing from. These are in some ways the agreed protocols and agreed ways that we think that we as humans should interact with each other. In 2007, the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was released. And yes, 2007, so it took quite a while for it to come together. And also we have the UN Sustainability Goals, which many of you may have encountered. Now, one of the UN Sustainability Goals that's of interest is Goal 12, which is about the responsible consumption and production. So that's something that matters to services marketers and social marketers. Now, within these human rights, there's a number of key principles, and these were brought together in terms of transparency and accountability, equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion. Now, these human rights principles can be used by service marketers in their everyday operations. Are we encouraging participation? Are we being inclusive in our language? Is our service available to people of all abilities? Now, services and social marketers can bring together social justice by focusing on removing systemic barriers. And this can take various forms. We can ensure that there's access to our service and that people have some degree of choice and that they can exhibit their consumer sovereignty. They can choose. That there's real participation in the service to make sure that our service has universal design so that people with disability are able to access and use our service fully. And we can also expand our understanding of the different types of justice, which are common in the services marketing literature, those being distributive, procedural, and interaction. Those types of justice are mentioned purely in the service complaints and recovery literature, but there's obviously an opportunity to extend that more broadly to what services are trying to achieve, in that our goal is to uplift and uphold human rights. So what can we do about it? First, we can recognise our own positionality and acknowledge a privilege. Social justice and social change starts with you, because your worldview will shape the services you design. Your worldview and the language you use will have a massive impact upon the way you interact with others, your gain frame versus your negative frame, and will reflect your strengths-based view rather than your deficit view. And this is quite interesting because often we start by looking at the participants, the people we're working with. Rather, you need to start with yourself. It's important that you understand that your own positionality, your social position, and attributes that you have as a part of your intersectionality, whether it, for example, is that you're an Anglophone or you've come from an English-speaking language, or whether you've got university credentials, how they have privileged you and provided you with access to resources that others don't. So this is that soul searching. Start with you, and as it's got on the bottom there, you have to understand your own unconscious biases, and frankly, you have to be brutally honest with yourself. What we often find, or what I've observed in social marketing and services marketing, is that people bracket themselves. That is, that they see the phenomena and the people they're dealing with at arm's length. That it's not that's not about them, it's about the other. It's called othering. And so that's why the first step towards genuine social justice starts with you acknowledging your privilege and you understanding how the system has benefited you in some ways. The second way we can move forward is to adopt a strengths-based approach, and we've had some wonderful definitions and discussions about this. Now, with a strengths-based approach, we simply assume that people are competent and knowledgeable individuals. So it assumes that all people, everyone we're working with, has strengths and capacities, that they can change, that they can grow through their strengths and capacities. We also understand that sometimes we're placed in states or circumstances which blind us from noticing our own strengths. So maybe our role as service and social marketers is to help people to unblinker and to see their own strengths and to revive their hope and aspirations. It's also important to understand, as Rebekah identified too, that people do have the expertise to solve their own problem. So this goes all the way back to that definition by Baker, this idea that people are powerless and that they cannot solve their own problems. The third way that we can bring about social justice is by reframing consumer vulnerability. So as Rowan identified as well, we all experience vulnerability. It's a part of the human condition. And as if you look in the law literature, for example, it's very clear that they see that vulnerability is a part of the human condition. But as we know, the literature that we're seeing in services marketing is deficit-based, and the word powerlessness or powerless comes up quite a bit. And as identified earlier by presenters, often we see vulnerability as an irreconcilable endpoint, that it's not a part of a process experiencing hardship on the way to resilience. And also what we see in those definitions is that we see that the solution has to be given by another person, that it can't be self-determined. Now, we've all experienced vulnerability because we're all human. Now, we ourselves have had those moments of fragility. And then through those moments of fragility, we've given rise to introspection. It's made us rise up and enable action, and it's made us resilient. So some of the vulnerabilities that we talk about are not always visible, and they require self-disclosure. And I think that's a really important thing, because a lot of the services literature is starting to point to this idea that service managers and employees can see and diagnose vulnerability, and that we should be looking for it. But the fact is that unless we tell someone or let someone know, unless we disclose, not all vulnerability is visible. So myself, Rebekah and Kate have an article under review where we wanted to reframe the definition of vulnerability, of consumer vulnerability. We wanted it to be strengths-based and human-centered, but we also wanted to focus on the process, that there is something that comes after vulnerability. It's not an endpoint, it's not a permanent state. And we wanted to be solutions focused, because a lot of the definitions focus on the cause of the vulnerability, not what happens as a result of it. And as we know in life as people, that's probably the more important thing, where you come, not where you come from, but where you're going to. So our definition was that experiences of vulnerability are subjective perceptions of susceptibility. They're part of the human condition. And they may come to pass with the passage of time. We've all experienced that, where we've had a sense of vulnerability and over time it has alleviated itself. It may give rise to resistance and acts of sovereignty. It may give rise to reactance and responses where people stand up for themselves and people take situation into their own hands to resolve a situation. It may also prompt introspection, where we take time out to think about what's happening around us. Now, vulnerability is subjective, so it's in the eye of the beholder. And why it's really important here is because the literature is starting to suggest that service marketers, managers, or employees should somehow determine if a customer is experiencing vulnerability. And my question is that their right to? Should we be? What if a service employee thinks that somebody is vulnerable, but they get it wrong? What if they insult that person or embarrass that person, or they're just completely wrong? And what if our intervening goes wrong? What if we take action in a service context because we think that somebody is vulnerable and it results in more harm? You know, litigation, liability, beyond those things, the moral issue of why did we intervene and is it our place to? So I think those are really important moral and ethical questions to be addressed at the beginning. And I make the point here, which is also made in the article with Rebekah and Kate, that while we as marketers possess social and emotional intelligence, the fact is we are not formally trained social workers, counsellors, or psychologists. So we cannot legitimately diagnose vulnerability. So in many ways, vulnerability, because it's subjective, has to be disclosed, self-disclosed by the individual themselves. Now, we've all been there where we've had a bad day and someone's asked us how you're going, and you just say, great, I'm doing well. So we know that it is up to the individual to determine whether or not they wish to disclose that. Leading on from what Rowan mentioned and Rebekah mentioned about labels, one of the interesting things, for example, in the Indigenous research field and Indigenous studies is that the imposed labels have been imposed on Aboriginal peoples and Indigenous peoples around the world without their choice, without their consultation, without them selecting it for themselves. So imposed labels like vulnerable, calling a group of people vulnerable or people in a certain situation vulnerable, when it's used as a collective noun, is not only presumptuous, it's oppressive, and in fact, it can do more harm because you're perpetuating stereotypes and you're engaging in stigma. So with my work, for example, with educational inequality, working from people from a range of marginalised groups, it was important to understand their point of view and to not impose labels. So for example, with Aboriginal people in Australia are often referred to as Indigenous, whereas Aboriginal people by choice, I refer to myself as a Murri, which is a Queensland Indigenous person. So if you ask me, I'd say I'm a Murri. Those labels are often imposed by government as well and others and funding bodies. So in terms of how we move forward, a lot of the research agenda at the moment is focusing on understanding what vulnerability is. But I want to move that forward a little bit more and suggest that we look at who experiences vulnerability, who diagnoses it and who remedies it in a service context? You know, where do these lines of responsibility, and are we getting out of our lane by asking service managers and service employees to diagnose vulnerability and then do something about it? So there's some really important sort of, I guess, lines of ethics around this. We need obviously a more comprehensive typology of services marketing, typology of vulnerability and services marketing too. Not only that, what it is, but the duration of it, how it's expressed, whether it's visible or invisible, or if it's disclosed or not disclosed, whether it's cognitive, emotional, or social. We should also look at the process of vulnerability. And importantly, we need to get our heads, I think often it's a result of our training as mostly as quantitative researchers, as positivists, we see things as mutually exclusive and existing. It is possible for vulnerability and its strength to coexist. So vulnerability as strength is a possible research agenda as well, where being vulnerability is a process towards resilience, and also vulnerability as a way to inciting strength within us. And other phenomena, risk tolerance, help-seeking behaviour, and the use of inclusive and person-first language conventions. Now, what are the obligations that we have to create a socially just service? Well, obviously, as service marketers, we have a legal obligation. So in some countries, it is the law that staff in public services must respect and protect human rights. In other countries, they've used their system of discrimination acts. For example, in Australia, we have the Racial Discrimination Act, and that all services must comply with these as a part of their consumer rights as well. But I want to point on the fact that as services marketers, that we have a moral obligation to create socially just services. And our moral obligation is to not only uphold human rights, but also to do no more harm to people who are experiencing vulnerability. And I think that's very important, the word more harm to people experiencing vulnerability. We need to make sure that even with the best of intentions, that we're not unintentionally having a negative impact. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was fantastic. Thank you for sharing your insights and critiquing the approach that we take as well. And I think that all four of our speakers this morning have done an excellent job of critiquing the status quo and how we approach things. And I'm not sure if I speak for everybody else, but you've certainly challenged me in the way I think and the way I approach language. And I guess a couple of key points from me was thinking about how it's really important for people of privilege when we're going into work with different groups to actually recognise our own positionality and acknowledge our privilege. And in my experience working with different priority groups, that's been really beneficial in them opening up and actually sharing. So, and where you can really tap into those deep insights because you're putting yourself on that level playing field with them, and making yourself a little bit vulnerable at the same time by, you know, admitting that you actually can't put yourself in their position because you are coming from a place of privilege. One of the other things that really stood out for me is that use of the collective noun and labeling people as vulnerable. And, you know, and I think that's one of the key threads that's come across through all of our presenters today was about being careful with how we actually label people as well. And sometimes it's more important if we're thinking about using people first language, allowing people to put their own label on themselves if that's what they want to do. So again, I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers, and I'm sure that there is still plenty of questions in the chat, but we have run out of time. I just wanted to let you know that the Padlet activities will remain open for a week or so, so you can pop in there and share your thoughts, which would be really appreciated by all of the panel speakers. But I would just like to close off now by saying thank you very, very much to our presenters. I do agree. I can see the chat popping up that people found this a very uplifting panel session, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. It's fantastic, and it's been really nice to take 90 minutes out of the busyness of life to actually reflect on what we do as academics and practitioners, and how we work with people who we all, no doubt care very, very much about. So from a services social marketing perspective, thank you. That was really, really insightful. And thank you so much to everyone from around the world for joining us. And I know that many people are going to listen to the recording as well, because the timing just didn't quite work out for them, particularly if they're in Europe. So thank you very, very much, everybody, for attending. And thanks again to our speakers. And thank you to Sam and Kate for driving the back end this morning as well. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you all so very, very much. Have a wonderful week, and thanks for joining us.